Is anyone not ready? No? Observation 1 is the resolution analysis. This is a fact ground as seen through the assertion in the resolution, meaning that the affirmation will be introducing arguments to prove said assertion true. That means that you, the judges, should evaluate all factual assertions through the lens of preponderance of evidence and evaluate the harms of specific arguments and impacts through the lens of global stability. Moving on to the second observation, which is that of definitional framing. The first and only definition the affirmation will be introducing into today's debate is that of this house. We see specifically as indicated in the resolution, this is Russia, further known as the Russian Federation by its official name. Does the negation have any questions? Seeing none, we'll be moving straight on to the substance and the inherency of today's debate. The first inherency point is going to be that Russia, in its current iteration after the Boris Yeltsin administration of the 90s, has moved towards an expanding partnership with China. The little A here is that during the 2000s commodities boom, China was the major buyer of Russian oil and minerals, particularly in the Russian Far East and in Siberia. We see that the little B point here is that this has tapered off as China has become a consumption-based economy and has now gone back to the previous situation where Russia mainly sells oil to other Asian buyers and other European actors. The second point here is that we see that Russia maintains a diverse set of international ties with other nations. According to Transparency International, at the beginning of the 21st century, Russia maintained strong bilateral ties with nearly 135 nations, but this has decreased as they move towards China to a total low of 37 today. Thus, the first F point, which is that of Russia global relations. The background here is that Russia and the United States have had extended relationships since the beginning of the Cold War. The little A is that historian Hans Morgenthau writes that independent Russia, as part of the Soviet Union and even part of the Russian Empire, had a diverse relationship with the United States that stretched back for centuries through the lens of global cooperation and competition. The little B here is that this has been clouded by the rise of China. The warrant here is specifically Kenneth Schultz, a professor who specifically states that the rise of China has complicated the international relationship between Russia, the United States, and a variety of hegemonic actors as China's internal party politics and global plans disrupt Russia's own autonomy throughout the status quo. The two here is that Russia's relationships with independent actors, particularly those that are adversarial to China, have weakened in the status quo. The little A here is that of India, which is a previous ally of Russia, and its relationships between India and Russia have weakened significantly in the status quo, with the diplomat quoting that much of this weakening and chilling in relationships stems from Chinese pressure. The B here is that of Japan and South Korea, two major East Asian powerful actors who buy a significant amount of Russian commodities. The little I point here under this is that Reuters writes that a chilling effect has occurred between Japanese and South Korean relations with Russia due to the increasing influence of China. This has had a majorly negative impact on the economy, with Glencore, an international commodities consultant, writing that this has led to a slowing of Russian asset prices and led to millions of Russians being pushed into poverty during the 2010 oil glut. The third point here is that China oftentimes controls international commodity agreements that Russia is a part of. The little A here is that of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. There are two major actors against this, which is the United States, but primarily Russia. The little I point here under this is that AP News writes that China has oftentimes been exploiting international and internal pressure against Russia to prevent the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from going into place. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which goes between Russia and Eastern and Western Europe, would provide billions of dollars to the Russian economy that currently have been taken away during the COVID crisis and the 2010 oil glut. The little B here is this further includes Russian pipelines to India, both through oil tankering and international agreements over land. We see that much of these pipelines that have not come to fruition are specifically going to this point because of China. As Cypri writes in a 2020 paper, China has expressed international and internal strife against Russian efforts to grow closer and solidify their relationship with India, even though India serves to be a major buyer of Russian commodities overall. The four here is that this has particularly become difficult within the vaccination part of the COVID pandemic today. The little A here is that the China Daily newspaper writes that China has tried to limit the export of the Russian Sputnik 5 vaccine in lieu of promoting the domestic CanSino and Sinopharm vaccines, which are primarily negative since the Sputnik 5 vaccine has a higher degree of efficacy than any Chinese vaccine out there. The long-term implications of the relationship between China and Russia are clear. On the impact level, we first see that this increased relationship and move away from the United States has led to an increased chance of nuclear conflict. The Union for Concerned Scientists writes that a destabilized Russia, primarily through a closer relationship to China, leads to an increased chance of nuclear armed conflict with strategic weapons with the United States and Russia. This is going to be particularly bad on the impact level, since nuclear war is a global conflict that impacts the most people in a heavily dehumanizing manner. You should be preferring high magnitude and high magnitude, low probability impacts over anything else, because a small number times infinity is still infinity. The two here is that this is diplomatically isolated Russia. You can cross apply
point of information.
I'll take it at the end if I have time. You can cross apply the Transparency International warrant I read, which states that the number of relationships that Russia maintains with other states in a beneficial manner has decreased. I'll take your question now.
Yeah, so when it comes to relationships between Russia and China, isn't it more likely to cause nuclear war when you set these two nuclearly armed powers against each other?
We're not saying that Russia and China would be going against each other. We're simply saying that the warm relationships that they maintain today are negative. A strong relationship with Russia and China can exist, but that also doesn't have to mean that there's animosity. If anything, the affirmation is proposing that they could go back to the relationships between the USSR and China, which had competition instead of intense rivalry. The second point is that of Russian asset expropriation. You can cross-apply a lot of the warrants that I specifically give you, where we tell you that China has been exploiting Russia on an international stage. You can cross-apply the commodity terms that I specifically read, which tells you that Russia has gotten more and more internationally isolated. The second point that's going to be here is that of intellectual property espionage through this manner. James, an international defense consultant, writes that Russia has been losing a significant amount of intellectual property to China. This is particularly negative since it destabilizes the Russian economy, which is going to be affecting the millions of Russians that lack a stable job today, and has also destabilized Russia's national security. For all of these reasons, we're proud to affirm.
We'll get on to. All right. So quickly off time, I'm going to give an overview, then 3 off, then case. All right.
How many for each off argument? One sheet or more?
I don't think you'll need one sheet. You'll one sheet for each off.
Okay.
Where should I flow the overview?
Flow the overview on its own sheet. Okay. Is anyone not ready? All right, my time starts now. My partner and I negate the resolution here resolved that this House as Russia regrets Russia's expanding partnership with China. So first, an overview. Note that Russia has the relationships of a superpower, including both negative and positive ones, but without a lot of, but is fairly weak compared to the other superpowers like the United States and China. And this puts it in a very weird condition where it doesn't have the power to maintain those relationships, and so it needs help from another superpower. It's not going to get that from the United States at any time soon, as it's been lashing out the United States both publicly and privately with things like hacking. So it is necessary for global and Russian stability that we have some form of that Russia has a global superpower in the form of China to increase stability. First is a theory. The interpretation: when the actor is not the United States, we must role play as that actor. And so the violation. I'll take the point.
I asked for a text of the interpretation.
Yeah, my partner is putting it in there. And so the violation is that the violation is that by not evaluating on a Russian specific weighing mechanism, the side affirmation has violated this because they're looking simply at global impacts and not actually role playing as the actor at hand. So the standards here is first predictability. The resolution very specifically states an actor. Look at side affirmation's case. If the clause as Russia was taken out of the resolution, AF's case would have no difference in this round. Why it is unpredictable to be going off of a resolution that could be basically completely different. The other one is ground. Putting an actor gives important net ground and important AF ground. So not only are they stripping ground from the side negation, it also means that there's less breadth of education because we're not talking because we don't have access to actor-based ground. The final one, another standard is role playing. When we put our feet in the shoes of other actors across the globe, we learn more valuable information and take away the usual Western and U.S. centric viewpoint of parliamentary debate when the actor tends to be the United States. When we're given an actor that isn't the United States, it is necessary to role play as the actor to expand and prevent U.S. centrism in speech in parliamentary debate. And then the other one is yes. Okay, so then the voters of fairness and education being predictable and following what the resolution. Oh, sorry, no. And then another standard is topicality, because this is a facts debate, and their arguments don't actually relate to the fact at hand, including all of the resolution, including the clause as Russia. We lose topicality. So the fairness is the one voter is fairness is to have not going with the full resolution and not being predictable is unfair to side negation. Also, same that goes to taking away neg's ground. And then finally, and same goes with topicality when it comes to education, not getting the useful ground of talking about this actor and not expanding our horizons beyond U.S. centric debate is necessary. Further, you can weigh as a voter that this is taking this house as blank topics, which mainly come from the East Coast, maintaining that kind of following the structure that the framers intended, and following that East Coast structure put out is necessary for improving debate and extending parliamentary debate to East Coast debaters and making debate more accessible. Vote on competing interests to avoid judge intervention. Reasonability has no bright line, and further, don't allow RVIs. You can't win a round just by being topical or just following rules. Drop the debater. The disadvantage. Contention one is partnership with China is key for the Russian economy. Currently, we can see that Russia increased lending with China after the 2008 crisis, according to the Nueva Institute of International Research of International Relations. So basically, China was crucial in bailing Russia out after 2008 and preventing economic collapse after the 2008 recession. The second point of uniqueness here, the second point of uniqueness is that it is part of is that Russia has been engaging in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is crucial to providing trade relations for the Russian economy, according to Ponsar, a research group, Ponsar Eurasia research group. And finally, we can see that Russia has been losing trade with the West, especially the United States, because of its annexations of Georgia, its annexations of Crimea, and attacking of and its interference in the 2016 United States election. So so those interactions with U.S. allies and other Western states is becoming increasingly inviable, not because of China, but because of Russia itself. That means that the partnership has served to stabilize the Russian economy, improve the Russian economy, and prevent the collapse of the Russian economy that happened. Sorry, I don't have any time for more questions. And prevent the collapse of the Russian economy that would have occurred after 2008, if not for Chinese lending. And so the impacts here is preventing economic collapse, and because of that, preventing the cycle of poverty, improving quality of life, and decreasing the possibility of territorial wars by Russia as they strike out for more economic resources. Now, going into my opponent's first point on global relations, first thing we can say that Russia has lost of its chance with relations with the West and United States allies like South Korea and China, for example, not because it's engaging with with China, but because it's directly attacking the West and attacking the United States. A relationship soured with the United States, and sanctions were created by NATO and the United States, not because of increased relations with China, but because hacking of the 2016 elections and the invasion of Crimea. remember, with the Russian ties with the West and the United States is basically impossible when you look at the history of the Soviet Union. The only time Russian ties with the United States were actually able to flourish and increase was when there was a Western American puppet in the form of Boris Yeltsin. Under the Putin administration, under the Putin administration, there was no chance for relations with the West. So Russia needs to turn to needs to turn to China to prevent it from becoming isolated and actually creating more strength when it comes to international relations. This is Putin's fault, not China's. And so that applies to the South Korea, which is a very strong U.S. ally. That applies to India, which is an increasingly strong U.S. ally as well. So then they say that this causes this destabilization will cause an increased chance of nuclear war. Turn the point on nuclear war fully towards our side. China, according to Sipri, as Russia-China relations increased, Russia decreased its consideration of China as a nuclear threat significantly lower, showing how Russia, when those relations are in place, the possibility of nuclear war and nuclear conflict between Russia and China is increased, and that just makes sense because they're much stronger allies. When you look at the big dangers of miscalculation that have happened in the past with things like the Russian Missile Crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, where we were inches away and one person away from nuclear miscalculation, increasing the having warm relations between two nuclear armed powers is crucial. And further, we can see that isolation of nuclear powers, like we saw with Iran and North Korea, leads to an increase in nuclear proliferation. We can't stand for this. That's why China-Russian relations are so key to economics, to stability within Russia and all across the globe. And that's why I voted neg.
Okay, give me 1 second. There's no like flex period, and like I can't ask a question now, can I?
That's correct. There is no flex time.
Okay. So the order is going to be T, the affirmation case in order, and then the neg single off. Cool. Is anyone not ready? No? First on the theory, before the convening or interpretation, let's go to the we meets. First, we meet. We tell you we role play as Russia. Specifically, all the impacts we impact out to are specifically on the front of how we as Russia would react. For example, we tell you Russian stability or the chance of nuclear war is harm. That's specifically telling you that we are acting as the Russian house, and we regret expanding because it means we have a higher chance of nuclear war with other countries, for example, the United States. Secondly, on on the same we meet on commodity terms, we specifically talk about how less stable job opportunities exist within Russia. Therefore, we're telling you as the Russian state, we empirically have less. They don't tell you what role playing means, which probably means is a very thin line as to how you can evaluate what role playing means. They try to tell you the violations that we don't do the weighing mechanism, but we tell you the weighing mechanism is how you can evaluate impact of the role playing that we think actually comes from is us representing Russia and the ideals of Russia, which we can then evaluate against the other weighing mechanism. There's no reason why a weighing mechanism ought to be a way to evaluate role playing. The second we meet is that this really only applies to policy rounds. LARPing only happens in policy rounds. We don't have to, there's no specific actor in this round because no action is actually being taken. We're just talking about a perspective of past facts. We're not actually taking an action, we're not doing a policy. Therefore, this is totally relevant to a fact round. Like we're not LARPing. So therefore Russia is not an actor. They're just a subject, which means it's entirely separated. We both meet. This is probably a good interpretation for a different round, but there's no actor in this round. We still tell you we're role playing as Russia. So the counter interpretation is when the actor is not the US, we must role play as the actor if asked. Therefore, they can ask any sort of clarifications as to whether this is a fact or policy round. They could have changed the weighing mechanism. They could have asked us to evaluate this as a policy round. That's probably preferable to their model debate. Let's go to their standards. They say predictability, but there's no bright line predictability. Something they think is predictable might be not predictable to us. Therefore, there's no reason to evaluate why they think is as unpredictable. Also, they didn't lose any single ground. They still had all the arguments they could run. Like us not role playing as Russia didn't do anything, but we actually role played as Russia. We took zero ground from them. Like they still have the exact same ground in the debate. Prefer proven abuse over potential abuse. There's no abuse here at all. And they would tell you about topicality. This isn't fair. Again, we didn't take any fairness away. Like we're just like it's an irrelevant foreign debate. Prefer reasonability. They have to win every single standard. That's a good bright line for how you can value this debate. They also don't read you an a priori. Therefore, you should prefer case over theory because case actually has portable impacts in this round. Even if it's not policy making, we can still talk about specific actors that we can apply to a policy space later on. That's the most portable impact. T. They didn't even tell you if you have the rules to play the game. That probably means it's not even an a priori issue. Let's go to the affirmation case in order. Let's go down the line by line of Russian global relations. First off, the only argument they give is it's directly attributable to the United States. A couple of responses. First, my partner reads the Transparency International War about how most of the impacts as to why the relations are sour in the status quo, as to why the number of countries Russia has partnered with went from 135 to 37 is largely due to their closer ties with China, because a lot of people view China as a bad actor. Much of this decline also happened in the 2000s prior to many of these claims. That means most of the relations in the status quo are actually more related to expanding towards China. The reason why people view China and think them as a bad actor is not only due to their Uyghur human rights abuses, but because BRI is ripping countries off. In fact, Russia has actually been ripped off by BRI themselves. A train line between Kazan and Moscow that cost $22 billion that China said they would help fund is actually being delayed indefinitely because Russia is not able to have enough infrastructure to support it because China is abandoning them. That probably means that there's actual tensions between Russia and China and status quo. It's also probably why other countries are abandoning Russia. Look at the fact that most people are upset that Russia is expanding towards BRI if people view BRI as unfavorable. The examples they give about Putin and other things happened in 2008 and in the 2000s prior to most of the other claims that we're making. We tell you that Crimea and other elections that may have put Russia in a bad light had already only harmed an already bad situation. Even if you reject the claim that that global relations with Russia is due to an entirely different source, there's a lot of other substance we read on this point that's probably really key. First off, we tell you specifically about pipelines to India and how other countries are important and bad for vaccinations, at the point where relations between China and Russia are sour because China is preventing the Sputnik vaccine from coming into their country, or at least Russia is unable to export the Sputnik vaccine. It's probably bad for public health because the relationships are sour. They didn't put any other offense against this case, which means you can evaluate this as true. Further, we can also see a couple of other points here, like relationships with other adversarial actors. For example, India, Japan, and South Korea are all directly tied to China's unfavorable policies with tourism. For example, China has been using a tourist policy to reject or to try to mitigate Chinese tourists to go to South Korea, and they're potentially using the same policy against Russia. They try to tell you this in the overview that Russia is not very large and I have to go to another global superpower, but Russia is one of the largest economies with the third largest standing army. It's not a weak superpower. It can stand alone. They've been trying to go to China for other economic reasons, but that's obviously failed. A couple of other economic arguments here that they fundamentally ignore. The quality of life and the disposable income that people have in Russia is decreasing the status quo. China has transitioned to a consumer economy, and in 2021, Sinopec, which their main oil producer, said our oil demand is peaking and will peak in 2025, which means that China is now producing more oil than they need to export. And Russia's economy had largely relied on Chinese exports of oil as they had moved closer to them, but now China is exporting a lot less oil because they produce them for themselves now. So Russia is actually now in a trade deficit for the first time in 20 years as a result of going to China. And the diplomat reported that the disposable income that people have in Russia decreased by $500 at least as a result of them moving to China in 2020, and is only getting worse. That probably means that Russia's focus on a domestic production has proven really problematic at the point where they relied on external demand, but external demand with China is going down. And China has stated themselves like this is intentionally exploiting Russia because they for so long wanted to get economic extractions out of China, but it's not failing them. This is probably a reason as to why us as Russia are probably seeing this as a bad thing for economy. Other than that, they don't have any other largely offensive claims. On the nuclear war impact, they tell you that Russia-China nuclear war, we're not going for that scenario. We're going for a Russia-US war. We tell you US is becoming isolated from Russia to the point where Russia has almost no agreement to other countries, only 37. That probably means that it becomes isolated between them. So even if Russia becomes more unstable as a result of a poor economy and other scenarios, that probably means that there's a higher risk of misconflict. Even if it's a really, really, really low probability impact, it's still high magnitude. There are also other high magnitude impacts and high probability impacts you can vote here. For example, the economic impacts. Russia's been really harmed economically by China, and IP theft is another impact that leads me to the second advantage. The second advantage is about commodity stealing. They give no offense against this, so it's basically an easy vote for the F on this point. First is IP theft at the point where where Russia is exporting military technology to China, and then China steals all that military technology to build weapons themselves. This takes over Russia's military advantage, and China has then also stated themselves we're intentionally stealing IP the same way they steal vaccine IP from the United States. It's probably problematic for Russia and really bad for their IP as well, and probably leads to lower job loss to the point where their military technology becomes useless. Russia themselves in 2014 exported a lot of technology and said this might be to China and said this might be one of the biggest risks we've ever taken. It could pay off. It could pay off. It may not pay off, but it ended up being really bad for them. And now that China has a super advanced military that they've just stolen IP from Russia from. That's another easy impact of voting the F. Finally, go back to the T. Don't let them come up into the 2AC and say it's a priori. They never did. So therefore, if they try to uplayer, it's entirely irrelevant. We tell you that K should come before the theoretical argument. At the point where we already read 2 we meets, we are role playing as Russia. There is no actor because like it's not a LARPing. We're not LARPing. It's a fact round. We asked you a period for questions, so you could have asked questions to give like better ground that we didn't steal. Like it seems very frivolous. It's very potential abuse, and you should prefer proven abuse at the point where we didn't steal any ground from them. Okay. Finally, on some impact weighing at the bottom of this underview. We're obviously winning the impacts. Oh, sorry, their economic point. They made a lot of points about how Russia and China is good for the economy generally. We tell you this is not necessarily true. They give you examples about how in 2008 it was key to all the economic expansions. But again, sure, China may have helped Russia in the past, but what does the resolution say? Regrets Russia's expanding partnership with China. That means in the status quo, their current expanding partnership. That means we want to regret Russia's current expanding partnership. We tell you their current expansion towards China is really bad because they're being ripped off by China's consumer economy as their more domestic production economy, and they can't export their oil to Russia anymore. That's problematic because that's really hard on the economy. Disposable incomes have dropped by $500 per family on average, which is really problematic at the point where the economic partnership is really bad for Russia.
All right. The order is going to be T, the overview, the disad, then the F in order. Everybody ready? All right.
Wait, do you mind repeating that?
T, overview, disad, F in order. Time starts now. All right, so let's look at the theory. Starting off with the we meets. So first, on the we meets, they give 2 we meets. First, they say these impacts on Russia. That's absolutely not true. They read from the 1AC that they're talking about global stability. There are all kinds of issues where A would be in where Russia believes that they don't want global stability. To truly role play as Russia, we need to look into Russia's eyes and fill Russia's shoes, even if it's like worldwide, like not a good thing. Russia would like for example, the United States to go to war with Canada. That's that. Or if, as you can see, they decrease global stability by engaging in U.S. elections to their own benefit. Truly, this is why they don't meet. To role play as Russia, we need to take on the full role of Russia, even if it means like negative outcomes. Second, is, and to say like they were talking about only impacts on Russia would be a K-shift, and additionally, like to truly roleplay, like to truly roleplay, like it doesn't matter if all of the impacts are directly related to Russia. We need to like be taking the role from the beginning and make sure we're truly establishing the position we're taking. Secondly, they say that this only applies into a policy ground. That's absolutely not true. The resolution says literally grammatically this house as Russia. This is telling us to define the house and take the role of Russia and deciding what we regret. Yes, I'll take your question.
Is any action being implied to be taken in the resolution?
No, that doesn't matter though. Like well, I mean, yes, sure. The action is to regret. That's not really how this like works out. We're not like talking about the impacts of regretting, but still, there's a subject of that sentence. That subject is this house as Russia. So that's what matters. First, looking at the standards, they say predictability. We don't know what's predictable, but we can try to be more predictable, especially when the resolution explicitly states that this house is Russia. Like that's clearly more predictable is to use what the resolution says. Second, on ground, they don't really give any responses to ground. Think about okay, so say Soren like hits me, right? It's probably net beneficial bad that he hits me, but it might be in his interests to truly decide, but he won't regret it because it's in his interest to truly decide figure out whether or not somebody regrets something. We need to put ourselves in those shoes. Otherwise, like there is no ground because to the parties in opposition to the person doing the thing, it's always going to be regretful. So that obviously takes away ground. Third, on role playing, they say that they still play the role, but they explicitly say that They explicitly like, to play the role, you have to be talking not about global impacts, about Russian impacts. All right, let's look at the counter-interp. The counter-interp is the role play if asked. It turns out they actually violate their own counter-interp. Here's why. It may not be Soren and I asking them to role play as Russia, but the resolution actually asks my opponents to role play as Russia when it tells them that this house is defined as Russia. Now looking at the counter-interp. They read. Yeah. Now on to the counting standards. They talk about. They don't really read counting standards per se. They kind of just talk about like reasonability. And I tell you why reasonability is wrong. Reasonability leads to a race to the bottom. Reasonability leads to a race to the bottom. It leads to debaters trying to get everything that they can by the judges and leads to no actual debate, whereas competing interps is what actually leads to defined and the best rules for the debate instead of what is slightly passable. Plus, reasonability allows for judge intervention and has no bright line. Secondly, they say that there's no a priori. A, Soren read it, but B, it doesn't actually matter because the impacts on the voters we read are still come pre-fiat. Like, impacts on education and on East Coast awareness are still going to come first. Speaking of East Coast awareness, this photo goes straight drops, and it's really important. As like put in the announcements channel on Discord, this is supposed to be an East Coast style topic because it uses regrets and it uses this house. What this means is that this is an attempt by the NPDL topic committee to try and have West Coast debaters, like, I mean, I guess all 6 of us, try and debate in an East Coast style, making debate more reasonable and more applicable to East Coast. Our definition, our interp, as compared to the counter interp, is what those East Coast debaters expect and allows us to bridge that gap. They give no response to this voter, and you're going to be voting on it right now. Accessibility to debate always comes first, because without it, we will never see the NPDL become a national organization. We'll never see Parley become the amazing debate forum, and get the recognition that everybody in this room, or this virtual room, believes that it ought to. And again, since even if you didn't explicitly hear an a priori, which Soren read, and a drop the debater, these are still pre-fiat arguments that need to come before the round. You can't decide a debate without knowing the rules. Onto the just like jargon isn't how we should be deciding debate rounds. That's a matter of accessibility as well. All right, AF. Let's kind of look at the major problem with both advantages read by the AF is the fact that it does not it takes for granted the idea that any problems existing in Russian right now are somehow China's fault. But we see this isn't true whatsoever. Soren read you in the previous speech that the problem with Russia's current situation is that it holds the position of being of the USSR. It holds all the enemies that the USSR had, because it still has immense amounts of ties to its history, even if that's not the country it is right now. And the problem for Russia is that that's not the country it is right now. Compared to the USSR, it is absolutely not it is simply not possible. It is simply incorrect to say that it is on the same level of superpower it used to be. It is not tied for the biggest superpower in the world. It's definitely not even the biggest superpower, like maybe, I don't know, 4th or 5th. And so but it still has these ties and still has the relationships of the biggest superpower in the world. And what it means is that any problems with the West come from the fact that the West still treats them and still has the relationships with Russia as if it was their sworn enemy and the superpower that they were opposed to. And we see that the moment that Yeltsin was kicked out of Russia, the Western puppet, we saw that there was no sort of strong relationships whatsoever. They read these kind of evidence that say like the number of relationships that Russia has decreased. That's just what you're going to expect with the creation of a new government. Finally, nuclear is something that's being won by the neg. We see that the only response to what Soren tells you about nuclear is that they're going for Russia-U.S. nuclear. Again, Russia-U.S. nuclear is equal probability in all cases, because Russia will always, no matter what China's position is, will have bad relationships and potential nuclear relationships with the United States. We saw this because there was these problems with the USSR
and in Russia before it got relations with China. Whereas we've seen empirically with our Cypriot evidence that the increase in relations with China has been directly tied to a decrease in nuclear war with China. That's the biggest nuclear impact in the land, and the reason you're voting no on substance.
All right, quickly off time. I'm going to be looking at T, looking at the role of China in Russia recently. Oh yeah, T, 2 voting issues and weighing. How about that? All right, starting time now. So first, let's look at this theory shell. My opponents don't really attack the bulk of this and the actual voters that we talk about. So first, let's remind ourselves of the standards here. The resolution says as Russia. Basically, my opponents disregard those 2 words and treat it like that doesn't exist. That's not predictable, and that's not topical because it's not actually following the resolution. We're talking about the regrets of Russia, not the regrets of someone looking at at global stability. Further, we can see because Russia does not value solely global stability. That's why they intervene in election. That's why they intervene in elections. That's why they annex Crimea. And so, because of that, they don't meet. And if you were to buy their we meet, then you're going to drop them on a case shift because they're changing the very concept of what they're debating about. They're changing the weighing mechanism as they support as they say, and that can happen in later speeches. So it's non-topical, it's non-predictable, and it takes away ground. It takes away very important ground, and it takes away very important education because you lose the ability to actually you fall into the U.S. centricness that can start to happen. So let's look at the voters here. So first thing, following what the resolution says is far more predictable and far more fair. That's not refuted. My opponents don't really say that they're following the resolution here. They're not, and they're just disregarding those 2 words. This is in-round abuse, and it's really dangerous for debate going forward. Yeah. So then further look at all right. Now then look also the idea of role playing is crucial to preventing US centric education. When the framers of the resolution say, here, use this foreign actor, and then we say, no, we're not going to use that foreign actor, we fall into a dangerous US centricness, which is bad for education and causes problematic argumentation. That voter wasn't responded to either. And then the idea of access for East Coast debaters. We want party to spread. We want everybody to have access to this tournament. My opponents are landing in the way of that by trying to pull this East Coast topic into a West Coast paradigm, and it's really dangerous for this tournament and for Parley as a whole going forward. It doesn't matter if I did say a priori, I did say drop the debate, and I did say that you need to follow the rules before knowing them, but the voters that I give are pre-fiat and will always come first, no matter if I use the jargon or not. Now, let's look at the actual substance here. You're going to be preferring side negation on the actual warranted claims of an increase in nuclear tensions. Look at our Cypriot evidence. Russia's nuclear policy and Russia's interpretation as China as a nuclear threat directly was directly impacted by the increasingly warm relations between Russia and China, according to Cypri. Russia directly devalued. Further look at my analysis when it comes to isolated nuclear powers. North Korea and Iran are examples of isolated nuclear powers who are looking to expand their nuclear arsenals. Because Russia has become isolated from the United States, if this relationship were not to exist and they were isolated from China as well, we would see an expansion and an increase in nuclear proliferation. My opponent states it best that an infinitely big impact times the smallest number is still infinite. That's why you're going to be voting for side opposition. That's why you're going to be voting for side opposition, especially because we haven't seen a nuclear war in the status quo, which is in the status quo where these relationships exist. So when you're weighing, you have to prefer the nuclear war argument over things like economic or IP stealing, because deaths come first. This is the highest magnitude, and you have to prefer nuclear war. You have to devalue probability because an extinction level threat must come first. And my opponents point this out in the first speech. That's why I'm proud to negate.
Okay, great. You could probably flow most of the 1AR on a new sheet. This is going to be an overview. Then it'll be the case and voting issues. Is anyone not ready? No? The round overview. There are a couple of things we need to specify. First, we meet. They specifically tell you, and my partner, as he outlines, that regrets is not an action tell you. They further don't tell you how we are not role-playing after Davis gives you specific examples of the affirmation considering the argumentation from Russia's perspective. They further go on to harm their position by not defining the definition of role-playing after Davis prompts them to in the 2AC. This means that you can't vote on any of the theory and it becomes a wash. Furthermore, Davis specifically tells you to prefer proven abuse over potential abuse within the debate space. That means that you view this paradigm, and since the block doesn't answer this specific term, the T debate becomes a wash. They further don't answer the bright line on predictability that Davis tells you is needed to analyze the round. They further don't answer the competing interpretations claim that Davis makes, where he tells you that they need to win every standard to win the shell. We further tell you that creating interps, as Davis tells you, creates a race to the top where everyone tries to write the best interp possible. They don't tell you why to prefer the potential over proven abuse. They don't uplayer either. The a priori point doesn't stand. If you wanted more ground for us to role play, they could have defined the weighing mechanism, but they don't. That means that it's frivolous. Because you lack the ability to define proven abuse within the 2N, the theory doesn't stand. We further give you analysis which states that the only portable impact from today's round is that of the round-based education stemming from the topic. Since the affirmation wins specifically here, as Davis tells you, you can make all of these extensions and sever out of the theory. On the case debate, magnitude is no longer a good framework to evaluate the rest of the debate. Both sides impact out to nuclear war, meaning that you need to use probability and time frame alongside a case-by-case comparison of other impact weighings. First, on the economics point, we are the only side that impacts out to dehumanizing poverty. We specifically tell you within the debate that Russia is no longer doing as well economically because Chinese oil demand has peaked, and this has brought down the disposable income of Russian consumers. We further impact this out to dehumanizing poverty, telling you that millions of Russian consumers have fallen into dehumanizing poverty, and that this is particularly negative and a terminalized impact. You vote here because this is happening right now with 100% probability. That means that we win on all three metrics. We further tell you that since this impacts the most people and we need to focus on the non-Eurocentric views with the Central Asian framing my partner gives you, that we can answer most of the claims they make. Second, on the point about time frame, we further win on the time frame claim. On the impact about nuclear war, we are specifically telling you that war is more likely to happen between Russia and the United States because it's being pulled towards China, and that expels it away from the United States. That means that we're winning on a further time frame of having faster nuclear war. At the point where both sides' magnitudes are the same, you're going to be using time frame to evaluate the rest of the debate. If a impact is qualitatively similar, you need to use other weighing claims. Since this is going to be happening faster in the affirmations world, and you want to try and push this negative impact as far away as possible, you vote for the affirmation. Furthermore, we further tell you that you should be preferring our side independently because they are the ones pulling for a West Coast paradigm by asking us to use an actor and live action role play in their interpretation when the resolution in fact uses no actor. If you buy none of that, the theory has no portable impact in voting shell. The 2N concedes that you need proven abuse to win the shell and that you need to win every standards. The we meet still stand, meaning that the case becomes key. Thus, the voting issues. The first is that of the economy. We pretty clearly claim here, through the preponderance of evidence format, that Russia's economy has been harmed. On the Nord Stream 2 case, we tell you that this means they lack access to European consumers, and this actively means that millions more people, because of the specific link chain we argue in our advantage, are no longer going to be able to gain access to Russian oil, and that's not going to be flowing into the hands of Russian consumers. That further means that dehumanizing poverty is worse in our world, and you vote for us on magnitude. On the probability front, we're winning there because we specifically articulate how this is happening in our world guaranteed, and this does not happen in the negation world. That means that you vote for us on probability. On the time frame metric, we specifically are able to outweigh on the economics point. That means that that voting issue in this round flows towards us. On the second point, which is that about nuclear war, we again win this. First, we illustrate this on the timeline by telling you that nuclear war with the United States from our Transparency International warrant is more likely to happen in the affirmations world than the negation world. That means that you vote for us here because we win on the time frame front and magnitude becomes a wash. We further give you this warrant about probability and how it's 100% probable in the aff world. That means that for those two voting issues and the fact that the T is a wash, you vote aff. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a 1-1 split decision. I voted for the gov. I guess I'll go first. So for me, I voted first. I'll start off on the T. I think so. The first thing I voted on the T is I bought the we meet argument that like they still did meet by talking about Russian stability and still discussing like impacts to Russia. And then the next is probably that I bought the no bright line to predictability, and that like I think that I personally looking at it, I didn't see that there was any lost ground. And I think the point that kind of hinged on is the fact that potential abuse versus proven abuse. So since that was kind of dropped and there was no proven abuse actually specifically mentioned, or like any arguments that you weren't able to make, I bought that. And yeah, so that was on the T. So since the T I saw as a wash, I kind of moved on to sort of evaluating the debate on the case. And so I just saw a lot more weighing on the affirmation, specifically because although both sides are weighing to nuke war, even if you consider that a wash, I feel that they have more impacts in terms of like the dehumanizing poverty caused by the economic harm caused by the relationship to China. And then in addition to that, they also make arguments and cross-apply their warrant from Transparency National to show that nuke war still happens faster in the gov world. And you can ask me questions about that too.
I will let students ask questions to Rashab if they have any before I go on with my RFT.
I don't think we have any questions.
Okay. So I split from Rashab, although I agree with a lot of his analysis. So for me, it ended up being a low point win for Lincoln. On the theory, I mean, Rashab is just right. So just cross-apply everything he said. I also think that it's ironic that you're running a theory argument and trying to collapse most of the round to theory. And your argument is that this will lead to more inclusion of East Coast debaters who are notorious for trying to have as little theory in round as possible. That didn't weigh in my decision, but I found it ironic. On the case debate, I think that the government makes a mistake by committing themselves to having nuclear war be the biggest impact in the round. They made that weighing in the PMC before they even knew how the round would proceed. Then Lincoln does the correct thing, which is like, oh, that's your biggest impact. Okay, we'll try to turn it. And then the Gov tries to get out of it in the rebuttal and be like, actually, never mind. Magnitude is not the biggest impact. Let's go for poverty. And their only argument for why magnitude is not their biggest, it should not be the most important thing in the round, was just, oh, well, both sides talked about it, so it's a wash. Let's look at something else. And I just don't buy that at all. And I think that given that it's an argument that's made in the last speech, I can kind of gut check that. I'm like, yes, both sides talked about it. One side talked about it better, and it wasn't you. The reason why I think that the op wins on the nuclear arguments is because the time frame analysis, as far as I understood it, wasn't super clearly explained, but it said that it makes it more likely that there will be a war happening with the United States soon, but I don't think that's actually a direct comparison. The direct comparison I'm looking for is what's more likely, a nuclear war between Russia and China or a nuclear war between Russia and the US. And I don't really know how the time frame analysis accesses that. I just look at, I think the argument for why a better relationship between Russia and China reduces the war, the likelihood of the war between Russia and China is kind of obvious and very intuitively made by the op. And I think that the Gov has a much longer link chain. They're saying like, oh, because Russia gravitates towards China, then you go through a series of steps where that deteriorates relations with the West. And at the end of that long link chain, you get a Russia-US war. But I also get a bunch of arguments about alternative causality from the op that says maybe Russia has bad relations with the West for a bunch of other reasons, like the fact that they keep invading countries and try to undermine American elections. That could be it. And the argument, the only kind of analysis that I get from the Gov is, well, in the 2000s, Russia had deteriorating relations with the West, and also around the same time, they had better relations with China. But I feel like all of the evidence that the op gives me about like Georgia or Ukraine was also happening in 2000s. So I just feel like that's a much weaker link story to access the same impact that you concede out of your first speech for no reason should be the biggest impact in the round. So that's why I vote for the op. Cool. Well, it doesn't seem like anyone has any questions. So good luck in your future rounds, everyone.